Welcome to our second public lecture, conversation, with our Andres Bello Chair, Mario Rufer. For those of you who were here a few weeks ago for Mario's first lecture, you know that the thematics that Mario is exploring this semester are very much anchored in thinking about archives and history and memory and representation. And we're really pleased to be able to sustain this kind of continued dialogue with him. The first conference, if you remember, was the Altered Archive, Dreams, Ghosts, and Murmurs. And today's conference continues that thematic in the Museum of Forgiveness, State, Violence, and Culture in Mexico. So Jordana Mendelson, I'm director of the KJCC, and on behalf of Marina Garde, assistant director, and Laura Torregano, special projects officer, I want to invite you this evening to think about not only this lecture, but also the kind of thematics that we've been exploring this semester at the center, the exhibition on Equatorial Guinea that Mario participated in conversation with, and also coming up on November 16th and 17th, Mario will be directing a two-day symposium in which these ideas will really be thought through with a whole range of scholars and artists and writers. So for me, it's not only tonight's conversation, but also thinking about it in a way kind of encadenado with a whole series of conversations that we've been having over this semester that we feel really privileged to enjoy with Mario. And also, I wanted to highlight that while Mario is giving our public lectures, he's also been leading a graduate seminar in La Memoria como Conexión. So I'm hoping that some of you in today's lecture are also joining Mario in that seminar, and really looking forward to seeing the result of that research that you're all doing together. Joining Mario this evening is Professor Josie Saldaña, who we are grateful to for having nominated Mario to the Andres Bello Chair. Josie has been on our advisory board for years, and we're always grateful for her suggestions. And I have to really especially thank you for bringing Mario to the center this semester. It's just been such a joy to engage in these issues and ideas together. We have a very full evening, so I would encourage you that if you'd like to research more about Mario, what he's been working on, any of the projects, to look at our website where there's a full biographical resume. And without more, Mario's going to give his talk, Josie's going to give a response, and then they're going to sit down together where we can continue the question and answer with everyone, followed by a reception. So please join me in welcoming Mario and Josie.
Well, good night. Thank you for coming. Tonight, I want to share some thoughts on a very problematic case on three indigenous ñañú or otomí women in Mexico, like from 10 years ago till now, and even some events that are happening now in Mexico City related to otomí people. In 2006, Jacinta Francisco Marcial, Alberta Alcántara, and Teresa González, three indigenous ñañú otomí women from the Querétaro state in Mexico, were arrested in their respective homes in Santiago Mezquititlan a Tuesday, after a typical day of selling at the street market. They used to sell food, fruit juice, and handicrafts. Deceived by police officers, deprived of their freedom without due process, the three were accused of having kidnapped 6 police officers from the Federal Investigation Agency. Jacinta was also accused of carrying narcotics, specifically cocaine. The crimes and evidence were fabricated on the spot. No due process was ever presented, and no access to a lawyer or translator. Jacinta did not speak Spanish. They never knew for certain until after their release why they were being detained. They were sent to maximum security prisons with scarce communication and visit restrictions, together with a formal attorney request for a punishment of 20 years in prison and an exorbitant fine. After spending from 2 to 6 years in detention, although each under different causes and temporalities, they were released due to insufficient evidence, but never dismissed as innocent. However, When the case was taken up by the civil association Centro de Derechos Humanos Miguel Agustín Pro Juárez of Mexico City, known as popularly as Centro Pro, the situation took a notorious turn. The civil association filed a case for public compensation due to the vulnerability of the detainees in their triple condition of women, indigenous, and poor. The Federal Court of Fiscal and Administrative Justice ruled in favor of the claim for moral and material compensation in 2017, 11 years after the arrest. The Mexican state was obligated not only to pay a restitution, but also to enact a public acknowledgement of their innocence together with an apology by the head of the acting Attorney General's office. In a way, the state obligated itself to make a public apology, which took place that February in 2017. The attorney's office filed a complaint saying to the executive branch that the apology would be unnecessary, but it was rejected by the Supreme Court. Well, that's the main picture, that it was very popular in the media. That day, most of the media paid attention to the words and the speeches of the indigenous women and to the lifeless speech of the Attorney General. No attention was paid, however, to the fact that I want to highlight here. The public apology was made in the Jaimes Torres Bodet Hall of the National Museum of Anthropology of Mexico, a museum that is one of the highlights of the Mexican exhibition complex inaugurated on September 1964, in the middle of the glorious era of the pre-political party. A museum whose focus is the glories of the indigenous past in its halls of archaeology on the first floor, and to match them with bucolic representations of the indigenous of the present in its ethnographic halls on the second floor. The latter are less known and much less visited than the archaeological halls. I did some research on the museum years ago when its conception of indigenous culture changes at different periods, but that's not the point I want to raise now. For those who don't know the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico, this is the entrance, very popular, and this is the umbrella, called the umbrella, or el paraguas. The umbrella is a kind of representation of an umbrella designed by the architect Pedro Ramírez Vázquez, which is a very known architect in Mexico, trying to represent the kind of protection that the state makes on the indigenous populations. In this lecture, I want to highlight that all the media mentioned the apology in the museum as a fact, almost a truism, as if it was obvious, as if the apology had to happen there. From the amount of material reviewed for this conference, I could only find a note from the newspaper El País, the Spanish newspaper, pointing out that having had the apology in the National Museum of Anthropology added symbolism to the act. I couldn't find anything else. Why does it seem obvious that in this case the apology from an agency of the executive branch specifically related to the prosecution of federal crimes had to be made at the National Museum of Anthropology? Why does it seem natural that a scene in which the state speaks to the citizens about its acts of injustice that targeted 3 indigenous women is staged in a museum, and in that particular museum? Are the offices of the Attorney General Office or the National Palace, where the President lives and works, or the solemn presence of the Supreme Court of Justice not the appropriate space for a pardon from the state? Even more, where should pardon be given to victims of the abuse of power and authority who the Federal Code of Criminal Procedures of 2006 defines as the average culture of the nation, as opposed to members of an indigenous people? Finally, what does this subtle shift from justice to culture allow us to think about the uses of the symbolic in the political field? As Tony Bennett mentioned, modern museums build an exhibitionary complex, but their sole purpose is not to exhibit something. They also show an order of discourse and an architecture of gaze. The political importance of the apology was undeniable and beyond discussion. The public recognition of innocence was at the same time the restitution of dignity to 3 indigenous women, together with the positioning of the state agents as public servants and not mafia bosses. As an act of state, the fact that the general attorney acknowledged its mistakes was key. And for Jacinta, Teresa, and Alberta, the fact that they were received with applause and ovation in their places of origin was also fundamental and restorative. All this is undeniable, as well as the political ambivalence in that public act. The need expressed by the state to lock certain subjects in the space of apology. When I say theater of forgiveness or scene of forgiveness, in no way I mean to imply that the act or the event was artificial. I am echoing a long tradition in anthropology or cultural studies that emphasizes the productive character of drama, ceremony, and pomp for politics. We know that theatricality is constitutive of the very power of the state, even the modern Western state. Then, again, why in the museum? From this clarification, I consider the public act of 2017 and the physical place of the events as a territory of dispute. To the same extent that power thinks places, it is also thought by those places. Through the recognition of innocence in a museum of archaeology and ethnography, the space reserved for the state and the 3 ñañú women was simultaneously reinforced. The executive branch and the Supreme Court visited the National Museum. The 3 women occupied a space that has a previously written script, where their presence is expected to act in the role of a national relic, their role of indigenous women, their role of innocuous beauty. But all this was exceeded during the event. Ricardo Rocha, a renowned Mexican journalist, was the master of ceremonies in the act. A proscenium crowned by the giant posters we saw with the faces of Alberta, Jacinta, and Teresa, the solemn act began with an unexpected number. A ñañú children's chorus sang the Mexican national anthem in their native language. Contained within the acoustic walls of the museum, the auditorium is crowned by the impressive and beautiful mural Dualidad by the Mexican artist Rufino Tamayo, that, like in a small diorama, houses everything that happens inside. This mural is the one I used for the conference flyer, if you see the flyer. Well, the anthem was followed by the speeches of Jacinta, Alberta, and Teresa, and later by the most contentious speech given by Jacinta's daughter, the one who speaks Spanish well, Estela. For those of us who followed the televised broadcast, it was impossible to ignore the murmuring, the shouting, the faceless voices that reverberated through the halls emanating from the darkened audience. It's interesting to hear the shouting originating from the darkness stalls in the middle of the solemn act.
Con nuestros presos políticos,
You can hear?
con mis compañeros maestros caídos, por mis compañeros cesados,
Lo de abajo, sí.
por defender lo que por derecho nos corresponde.
Los dos muertos se disculpan por la Policía Federal. Es un municipio que tiene ñañú, que tiene hermanos ñañú. El gobierno ataca a los pueblos indígenas.
Pido por ellos, porque por buscar mejores condiciones de vida y trabajo es el trato que recibimos.
Through the broadcast, you can't see the screaming faces, but we can hear them. While Estela is talking, the people in the public cried on behalf of the dead of Ostula. We are missing 43, nos faltan 43, in clear references to the massacre of indigenous comuneros in Ostula, Michoacán in 2015, and to the worldwide known massacre of students in Ayotzinapa in 2014. Prison for the real guilty, we can also hear. What's in a place? What's in a place? On September 17th, 1964, the National Museum of Anthropology was inaugurated with an enormous media coverage. At the time of the inauguration, the acting Secretary of Education was Jaime Torres Bodet, who gave his name, after his death, to the room where the state pardon was staged in 2017. At the 1964 inauguration, Torres Bodet gave a speech that included the following, quote, "After 4 centuries, in the beating heart of every Mexican lies a thread of blood that was stirred in the emotions of the presence of the rising sun, embodied in Huitzilopochtli. A thread of blood from our indigenous ancestors." End of quote. A thread of blood beats within all Mexicans. Blood, so democratic, and thread, such a noble element. Interestingly, in the ethnographic rooms of the museum where the apologies to the indigenous women were happening, in several cabinets, we could see scenes of native peoples, always in rural areas, represented by mannequins. Those mannequins were originally made in wood and more recently in fiberglass. At first modeled on urban adolescents to represent the average height of the native peoples, and much later modeled after actual bodies of indigenous peoples in the so-called ethnographic expeditions from the 1970s. The mannequins function as an allegory of the role of representation for the native people population from the state. History became blurred, invisible within everybody. Culture turned into a mannequin. It would be interesting to complement this with the Federal Code of Criminal Procedures with which Jacinta, Teresa, and Alberta were judged. The Federal Criminal Code prescribes the following in its last modification in 2006. Quote, "When the accused belongs to an indigenous ethnic group, an attempt shall be made to obtain the opinion of experts so that the judge may gain a deeper understanding of their personality and grasp," the verb in Spain is captar, y captar and grasp, "their cultural difference with respect to the average national culture." End of quote. What's the average national culture? The average national culture makes history and describes sovereignty, probably. The cultural difference produces different subjects in cabinets and museums. If we return to Torres Bodet's statement on the thread of blood, we can also read a key postulate about race. If there is something that in the average national culture that comes from the native peoples, it is better to keep it unseen, deep inside. that which is common between average Mexicans shall not be visible in the skin, gestures, or bodies. It is something out of sight, blood kept deep inside. What's in a voice? Well, in the act of forgiveness in 2017, the 3 otomí women named a spokeswoman who would speak in Spanish, Estela Hernández, Jacinta's daughter. There, she reminded the authorities that today, we, indigenous or non-indigenous, do not thank you. We demand of you, do your job well. End of quote. In fact, Estela, addressing the audience after her mother, mentioned, today, the Attorney General's office recognizes that the case was a mistake, but this is done in a forced manner and not by their own will. The apology comes from inept, corrupt, irresponsible officers. In her firm tone, in her ñañú dress, Estela said out loud, where are these public officials today? Federal agents, public minister, judge, and the accomplice of policemen who detained us? I hope I'm wrong, but surely they are still working and collecting from our taxes. They are still our employees. End of quote. Interestingly, Estela steals the spotlight from the Tamayos mural or the museum display cases, the children chorus anthem in ñañú, and the solemnity of the building. She reminds us that all those on the Presidium are their employees, the ministers of the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, and her secretary. Perhaps it's because of this, and not so much because of the apology itself, that Estela says the iconic phrase that appeared in the media the next day and was cheered with applause and ovation. Hoy nos chingamos al Estado. Today we fucked the state. Alberta, Teresa, and Jacinta know well that an apology does not fuck anyone, least of all within the museum that instituted them as tradition. Estela bears something that is at the core of the destitution of coloniality. They fuck the state, which is in carne in sanguine there, a state which she is observing there, not because its agents are forced to apologize to 3 indigenous women. Probably the state is fucked because those 3 women reminded the Attorney General, the Supreme Court minister, and the other members of the government that they work for those women. Nos chingamos al Estado with the metaphorical force of the colonial outrage now used by an indigenous woman, who speaks for all, she says, inversely recalls that specific character of territorial domination that Anne McClintock worked on years ago, the idea of penetration, conquest, violation of the virgin land. But that cartographic idea of the entire dominion of the woman's body as territory and symbol was always threatened by that which the colonial state, and of course the national state, could not control entirely. Therefore, nos chingamos al Estado is we fucked it, of course, but it is also we mocked it. We unveiled its parochial character. To a large extent, the museum fails to stabilize the cultural picture, and that act of forgiveness is an uncomfortable scene. Estela is an uncomfortable figure. Formulas of citizenship contested under the gigantography of her mother in a museum consecrated by Tamayos' marvelous mural. Estela emphasizes what the historical political language made unmentionable: the continuity of the violence of the state. She reinforces the yelling coming from the public, Ayotzinapa, Ostula, Tlatlaya. In the hall of mannequins and taxidermy, they display sculpture towards memory. And memory not as a gesture of remembrance, but as a work of connection. The connection of continuous violence towards indigenous people inflicted by or with the complicity of the state. Restoring innocence and granting an apology to 3 indigenous women was a notorious way of making the state recognize not only that it had committed a grave mistake, but above all, of making the state recognize that it operates on a modern colonial structure. The impeccable work of Centro Prod was precisely that, making the state confess this apparently contradictory and simultaneous double characteristic: modern, legal, de jure, and colonial. Outside the museum. In 2017, the same year of the public apology, the National Museum of Anthropology inaugurated a wonderful exhibition known as The Cultural Richness of the Otomí. The name of the linguistic ethnic group for ñañú or otomí peoples is Otopame. The show's promotional piece begins by showing the Otopame area on the famous Covarrubias map Mesoamerica, the same map which opens the ethnographic rooms at the National Museum of Anthropology, where the apology was given. That is the map, it's very famous. That's the detail of Otopame region, and that's the promotional of the exhibition.
Denominamos otopames a una familia lingüística que precisamente proviene de la gran familia otomán, que incluye 6 culturas: los otomís, los mazahuas, los lahuicas, los matlatzincas, los chichimecas, CONACyT.
Belonging to the wonderful series of illustrated maps that marked an era of popular culture in Northwestern countries, these specific ones are particular. The ones produced in this period, the maps from 40s to 70s of the 20th century, point almost exclusively to indigenous people. These maps signal where they live, what they produce, how they dress. The strong presence of Covarrubias map referring to the Otomí area is interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, because while it exhibits women and men in traditional customs, it also shows the natural attributes as extractable resources. In these visual proximities, cultural diversity is fixed in a register of the landscape. The map anchors what must be said, but also what is identified as a resource of use and resource of extraction. Secondly, the insistence on the map is important because it was contradicted by concrete social events. The year 2017 was not only the scene of the public apology at the National Museum of Anthropology and of the Otopame Cultural Richness exhibition. That same year, in August, in Mexico City, 3 Otomí communities and 28 families began to demand their right to decent housing and access to drinking water. Rogelio, one of the protesters, claimed in front of the microphones of the Mexican Radio Institute that year, "This is not only about Querétaro. Today, we are not there, far away. It's not the milpa. We are here, in the city. We have lived in the city for 3 generations, 28 families without access to housing. We are here. Not in the Covarrubias map, not in a diorama, not as mannequins." For 2 years, they staged sit-ins in different plantones, in different points in the capital city of Mexico, once in front of the National Museum of Anthropology, where they were exhibited. Finally, due to the total silence from the government in February 2020, the otomí community living in Mexico City took over and still occupy today, that's the picture, the offices of the National Institute of Indigenous People, el INPI. They even renamed it. Now, the INPI is called Casa de los Pueblos y las Comunidades Indígenas Samir Flores Soberanes. Samir Flores, a militant murdered in 2014. They have been occupying the offices for 3 years and have intermittent negotiations. They demand that the government allow them to use terrains and houses they occupy in their neighborhoods of the city and which, they say, were not occupied by anyone at the time. They demand water, access to school, and healthcare. I would like to turn now to a little toy that I'm sure you'll recognize. The Lele doll, an otomí handicraft known worldwide. Lele dolls were one of the main handicrafts sold by Jacinta, Teresa, and Alberta in Santiago, Mezquititlan, where the doll is supposed to be originated. They were arrested while selling those dolls and some foods. In an interview conducted in 2020, a few months after the takeover of the offices of the National Institute of Indigenous People, Felisberto Margarito, one of the spokespersons of the otomí community in resistance in Mexico, points out to the interviewer that several Lele dolls, this is very interesting, several Lele dolls are placed on the desks of the National Institute. Dolls that surely belonged to the government workers who could no longer enter to the building because it took. That's what angers us the most, he said. We were just an ornament here. Under the slogan, native peoples are not decorative pieces, la comunidad otomí no somos pieza decorativa, they have sat several times at negotiation tables without definitive agreements. But the Lele doll, of course, was exhibited in 2017 in the Otopame Hall at the ethnographic rooms of the National Museum of Anthropology. They were being sold outside the museum the day of the public apology of the state to the 3 women. And now, the doll can be found in the museum's official catalog and online store with the description, you can read that, these colorful creations are much more than toys. They are little ambassadors of our rich culture. Well, last October 12, just 15 days ago, this year, now, the occupation at INPI was dealt with in a new negotiating table. This time, the otomí families were accompanied by a series of Lele dolls, but they changed the traditional coloring. Now they were black and red, and with bandanas covering their faces, paliacates, in a clear allusion to the Zapatista movement. In front of the dolls, the families proclaimed, I quote, 531 years have passed and we have not been conquered. Our native peoples and indigenous communities continue to resist militarization, counterinsurgency, organized crime, and paramilitary groups that, in complicity with municipal, state, and federal governments, enjoy full impunity to impose mega projects of death, such as the Mayan Train, the Interoceanic Corridor, the Morelos Integral Project, and the Santa Lucia International Airport. And they also produce a poetics of connection with memory. They say, quote, today we are here fighting like 531 years ago, like 27 years ago that the National Indigenous Congress was created, and like 3 years ago that the Casa de los Pueblos was born. Telling this awful government that we don't want their progress, that progress is death. End of quote. And they also issued an ultimatum. If the government officials do not sit down to negotiate by November 3rd, next week, they will occupy all floors of the INPI, remove computer equipment, and, above all, they have threatened to destroy the archives. The archives. They know what nerve the word archive pinches in the state and in academic and political imagination. On October 12, Elena, an otomí woman who accompanied Felisberto, declared, all this, archives, desks, forms, talks about us, but they refuse to talk to us. We are not decorative pieces. We are not folklore, not cabinets. We are here. End of quote. Again, we are here. Now. Neither behind the glass, nor on the mural map, nor in Santiago Mezquititlan, nor in the cultural fixation. One of the main elements that I highlight in some of the papers I have written about the ethnography rooms of the National Museum of Anthropology is the scarce indication of changes, precise dates, political processes within the communities, or even their vision of history. Well, they are giving it today, outside the museum. If I go back to Jacinta, Alberta, and Teresa, of course, it was crucial for them to accept the pardon and attend the event, to inhabit the museum, to face the Tamayo mural, to take the podium, to chant in the middle of the act, "We fucked the state," to sustain the collective shouting. Months later, those who came from their own communities began a powerful struggle at the former National Institute of Indigenous People, now Casa de los Pueblos. The three women names, their faces, their voices, were already unforgettable. What does this relationship between museum, culture, politics, forgiveness, justice, and sovereignty teach us? Felisberto said in 2020 the following: we can no longer wait for justice from this state that archives, processes, and sells us to folklore. We can no longer wait. We know what waiting, together with exhibition in cabinets and writings in archives, mean to indigenous peoples. Hannah Arendt used to say, it is necessary to distrust when people have been beautified by power. Also, because that beauty is manufactured in a support that erases the time of the embellished object. Time belongs only to the one who represents. I must say now that the ethnographic halls of the National Museum of Anthropology are closed as a byproduct of the pandemic. They are under total renovation. Current curators say that the mannequins won't come back to the exhibition halls. There are extremely imaginative, responsible, and committed curators now. Well, let us then think about the power of an altered memory. Let us demand the inclusion of history, memory, and future in the rooms of culture. Hasta que la dignidad se haga costumbre, until dignity becomes a habit, is the closing phrase in Estela's speech in the Public Act of Apology in 2017, and also holds one of the banners in the occupation of the former National Institute of Indigenous People. Hasta que se haga costumbre, until it becomes an everyday practice, a historical narrative, a claim for justice, and no longer a sanitized cabinet amidst racism. A step from culture to memory. As Estela said, taking her dress and squeezing it as she stepped down from the podium, like someone tearing a leledol, never again in our name, never again with our bodies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. That is a really, really beautiful talk, and I really don't know how much more I have to add. I want to thank you for it. It's really stunning. It's also a very upsetting talk because for those of us who work on indigenous issues in Mexico and with indigenous activists there, this moment that you narrate, both moments, are another deja vu moment of the relationship of the Mexican state with indigenous peoples over the last 30 years. How many times have we been here before? How many times will the Mexican state be forced to recognize by a branch of the selfsame government its continuing persecution and violence against indigenous peoples, either intentionally for the benefit of some development scheme or as collateral damage in its war with the narcos, with, not against. The Constitution was altered in 1992 to state unequivocally in Article 2 that, quote, the Mexican nation is unique and indivisible. The nation is multicultural, based originally on its indigenous tribes, end quote. And just to be clear, Article 2 has 19 clauses spelling out the rights of indigenous people to self-determination, as well as guidelines that the state, on how the state might limit those rights in the name of national unity, as well as the state's special responsibilities to indigenous peoples and their territories. Es puro papel. The Constitution is just paper. Paper and memory. This is a set of terms that could describe the entire colonial project. The colonial archive versus indigenous memory. Of course, these were never opposing terms. Indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica had writing, and the Spanish knew that. They knew it well. This was especially acknowledged when they decided to burn the libraries of indigenous peoples. The Spaniards didn't know, however, that the graphic systems of Mesoamerican peoples were multivocal, combining graphic writing, alphabets, and glyphs with oral speech, with oral performance, because these indigenous peoples understood the performative nature of language more than 500 years before Austin and Derrida. But I want to steer us away from oppositional thinking with regard to this apology staged in the museum as tomb for indigenous people. I want to think about three terms with you, Mario, in ways that I hope will be evocative. The museum, memory, and costumbre, custom. The museum. Why the Museum of Art Anthropology? Your paper asks and answers. Why hold the ceremony there of all places? Because museums are holders of national bourgeois culture. Museum collections presumably hold the essences of nations, displaying key monuments or artifacts, key unifying events for the leisure of the bourgeoisie. And in the case of the Museum of Anthropology, this is precisely the indigenous cultures on display. But they hold it in the Museum of the Mexican State as a way of saying, see, we have always honored you, indigenous people of Mexico, for you are the basis of the nation. This was just a slip-up, a 3-year slip-up, during which you were imprisoned. But also, as you say, to contain these 3 women again in the museum as ornamentation. Actial, Tlacliaya, Ayotzinapa, Otztula, the names of these massacres shouted by the audience provides memory of the violent ongoing relationship of the Mexican National Project to indigenous peoples well into the 21st century. What would it mean to give the Museum of Anthropology over to the indigenous peoples of Mexico? To make the Museo de Antropología into the Museum of Indigenous Memory instead. A museum of memory that honored the historicity of indigenous peoples from the pre-colonial period to the present, a museum curated by them, a museum of memory that honored indigenous cultures, living cultures, as the true root of Mexico's culture today, and not merely as symbolic origin. One that recognized that Mexican culture is fully and truly in every way indigenous, from modes of intimacy and address, to religious practices, to intellectual genealogies. Mexicans live an indigenous culture. What if indigenous thought was recognized as such in a museum, as the epistemological origin of Mexican intellectuality? What if the museum honored costumbre, la costumbre de dignidad? What if that was what was most remembered? In Mexican Spanish, derived as it is from the intersection of Castellano and indigenous languages, costumbre doesn't only mean habit, like the habit of doing something regularly. For indigenous peoples, costumbre is a system of governance that currently presides over the thousands of indigenous communities across Mexico. Indeed, costumbre is even recognized as such in Article 2 of the Constitution. Quote, indigenous community is defined as the community that constitutes a cultural, economic, and social unit settled in a territory and that recognizes its own authorities according to their customs, i.e., to their governing practices. La costumbre de dignidad, the custom of dignity, takes on a different connotation when understood under the mantle of indigenous usos y costumbres. Rather than simply a platitude, costumbres are governing principles, principles that are enforced by indigenous communities, principles recognized in the Constitution as legitimate modes of indigenous jurisprudence. Costumbre as a form of law enforced in a community governed by consensus. What would it mean to mandate dignity with the force of an indigenous costumbre at the national level? To mandate the right of every Mexican citizen to have dignity. Again, this is what the group of urban otomí who took over the offices of INE demanded, dignity. No one ever said that indigenous people didn't have a marvelous sense of irony taking over the INE offices. They were demanding to live in dignity, literally to have dignified living spaces in Mexico City, which, by the way, is currently in the process of being renamed or adding Tenochtitlan to Mexico City. No one ever said that the Mexican state didn't have a marvelous sense of parity. Now again, just to remind people, Mexico still in 2023 has the most progressive constitution ever written. Housing is a guaranteed right in the Mexican constitution. So when these urban otomí took over the offices of INE and demanded housing in Tenochtitlan, not in the state of Querétaro, they are demanding that the Mexican state be true to itself, be true to the Constitution. It is indigenous people, once again, who are bringing the Mexican nation to fruition, as if they did not have enough to do already. Not the Mexican nation that hopes to contain indigenous peoples to the Museum of Anthropology, to the folkloric prehistory of the superior mestizo race with just that thread of indigenous blood, but a nation that is truly based on indigenous usos y costumbres. Stranger things have happened. Someday, indigenous peoples of Mexico won't be recognized only on paper, but will have their say over the government of Mexico as a truly plurinational country, with all of the very complicated negotiation that entails between mestizos and indigenous peoples. Se van a chingar el Estado racista mexicano para construir un Estado nuevo, basado en la costumbre de dignidad. Just as someday Palestinians will be free of occupation in Gaza and the West Bank. Palestinians, like Israelis, don't only have a right to exist, they have a right to exist with dignity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Josie, for your wonderful remarks. I just want to add two little things, not to add, but to react on. First, about the irony on taking over the building of the Instituto Nacional de los Pueblos, now, well, it was the Instituto Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas, is that the words of Felisberto, because he said it at some point, this is a huge place, and it's empty. And it's the National Institute of Pueblos Indígenas, and we don't have a house. You know, it like adding irony. And the other thing is what about the second article of the Constitution, which is like, because what I think is there is the separation, the division between history and culture. You know, in terms of you know, when you say Mexican nation has many cultures, but is only one nation, which is expressly said in the second article. What the state is saying is this could be a multicultural society, but not a multi-historical country. You know, the conception of history is only the conception of the nation, the period of the nation, the memory of the nation. And I think that that's the main thing for me about the second article and about what you were saying also. And
I agree. I think the second article is also an article, like as I said, it has both acknowledges the right of indigenous peoples to maintain their cultures and their governance, and also acknowledges the right of the Mexican state to curtail those for national interests. It has language about the betterment of, you know, seeking the betterment of indigenous people. I mean, it's one of these very self-contradicted things. And yeah, but I also think even though, you know, they did negotiate with the Zapatistas for, you know, cultural rights and not for, you know, autonomy, right? They refused to consider any of the other rights, but even that wasn't fulfilled. And one of the reasons is because what would it mean to recognize a plurinational nation?
Yeah.
It's possible. It's not, you know, it's not that
of course
hard.
it's possible. Yeah.
It's actually not that hard, but it's not in the interest of the state as it's now composed.
Well, you have to recognize different temporalities, autonomy, and you know, it's about the ordering of the whole organization of a state, and that I think that's the main point there. I don't know if we can open the discussion to the audience, probably.
Hi. So I was just wondering what, if any, or have been some of the changes in the sort of in the discourse or towards indigenous peoples during the Cuarta Transformación of AMLO. If there's been any, there's the wonderful Tren Maya and all of those, you know, things. But how is the if there's been like a sort of cosmetic change in the discourse towards indigenous people since 2018?
It's a difficult question because it's a very important question because you know the Cuarta Transformación, when if you read it closely, you know, you will find expressions such as, well, you are, it's a kind of reinvigoration of the Mexican nationalist discourse in terms of, for example, into 2021 with the 500 years, they said only one had 500 years. Some others said 700 years, not commemorating the conquest, but commemorating the foundation of Tenochtitlan. You know, you can see, for example, there was a huge exhibition called México, Grandeza y Diversidad, La Grandeza de México, México y Diversidad, in the museum of different parts of the city with a huge, like a commemorative book. But you know, the discourse is more or less the same in terms of the glory of indigenous peoples, the importance of their culture in the terms of, again, raíz. The term root is always used from the last 5 to 7 years. The thing is, with respect to the big projects of development, for example, Tren Maya or the Dos Bocas refinery, different places, there you won't find a unified indigenous position in terms of, you won't.
You won't find it a unified.
Some people, many of them are saying, we agree. We need work, we need development, we need something that rescue us from where we are,
We need transportation.
And we need transportation, we need bias, and then they are like supporting, not only supporting, they are participating actively in the development projects. It's very, even in the field of indigenous intellectuals, you could find completely opposed positions in terms of that. I think that the Cuarta Transformación put something in terms of the communities indigenous are not a kind of monad or unified or homogeneous opinion or cluster in terms of that. I don't know if Josie, you want to add something?
And they never have been, right?
Never have been,
That's
of course.
why the PRI lasted for 70 years, because they incorporated a huge percentage of the indigenous population, not by bribing them or, they incorporated them. They they addressed the needs as a corporativist state, as any historian of Mexican knows. But the other thing I want to say is you have to think of it also from the outside, like the Cuarta Transformación. Like, look what it's like Noam Chomsky said, like, tomorrow you could put me as president and I couldn't change anything, because of the structure. So, when he tries to address, for example, maíz transgenic, ya no sé si transgénero en transgénico, ¿cómo se dice en inglés? No sé.
Genomics or
Yeah, GMOs, yes. He's constrained by NAFTA or whatever it's now called, right? He's constrained, right? So that's why you have to skirt around it like, only Mexican corn, only organic corn can be used in tortillas, right? It's all ways of trying. He's hemmed in from the outside, and then indeed, indigenous people aren't unified on the inside. But that he has done something. He's done some things for some indigenous peoples. También no es que no haya hecho nada, ha hecho algunas cosas.
No, of course, and also, as I've said in the beginning of the presentation, performance, drama, symbolic acts are important, are relevant, are constitutive of power in both sides, not only for the state, And then the first act, of López Obrador, which was like the toma de mando with baston, the stick, and all that in terms with indigenous people, and not also that, also the mañaneras, which is I don't know if you know that, but the everyday conferences he is offering to the people, the language he is using, the kind of expressions and also the gestures in terms of are to those people sometimes, in terms of, and they were never took by the state in terms of interlocutors, not only like recipients, but interlocutors, and that's important, and it's an absolute change for many people. It's complicated. We have claroscuros, a lot of them, but we must say that, well, I is my opinion, or it's my position in terms of it's not the same. No, it's not the same.
Thank you. I have worked in Mexico as a foreign correspondent. You just mentioned that the Mexican Constitution is very progressive. Do you mean that in theory or in the practice?
In theory. Well, and in some practice, I mean, let's give credit where credit is due. Um, part of the reason why the original negotiation of NAFTA worked so hard to get rid of Article 17 was because of its success, right? Even today, and I say this and people are always shocked, even today, 53% of the arable land of Mexico is in the hands of indigenous peoples and 26% of the forest lands. I think what the Zapatista movement showed us was it's not enough to have control of the land if you don't have control of the political landscape, right? Because all of those people who own those ejidos, they've all sent their children to New York City to work because they can't have those ejidos be productive under the treaty, right? Those ejidos will never compete with imports, right? So let's recognize that, there are some things that Mexico did. It's also why squatting is so popular in Mexico, because if you squat a building, because housing is a right, chances are that building, you're going to get that building in the end, I mean, there's ways in which even today, it's still a progressive country.
And the last question, this January will be 30 years of the Zapatista movement. And what will be the balance for you 3 decades later? The position, they're in better position, worse, or the same? Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. It's not what I concluded in my book from 20 years ago, and that's for damn sure. What I predicted. Bad, never predict. I think that the last 30 years mark a distinct framework with which indigenous people fight. And that's thanks to the Zapatistas and to the indigenous movements that came before the Zapatistas that made the Zapatistas possible. Because, the Zapatistas no salieron de la nada, right? They were part of, couple of decades long movements. So I think that they've changed the discourse. I think that's reflected in the way in which the women felt the freedom to talk. They've changed the way indigenous peoples are seen in Mexico, and we're in a battle. I mean, not a battle in that there are guns on the street, but we're in a war of representation in both its political and its cultural sense, right? It's a war of representation, and the Zapatistas didn't achieve what they were contained in the end, in some ways, but they did achieve a kind of inspiration for indigenous movements, right? So that autonomy is now, not just indigenous pueblos are autonomous, mestizo pueblos declare themselves autonomous, I mean, it's something that it's a kind of breath of life.
I would like to add also about this picture, because I think that in terms of your question of the kind of balance, what balance we can do, I think that in some sense, for example, in what I was talking about, the Zapatista movement provided to some indigenous peoples, I don't know if provided is a good verb, but probably, yes, offered in a kind of a gift, a platform to talk about history, not culture, history, time, memory, in terms of we are here, we produce a narrative on our own history. And that's because of that I choose the picture and the dolls with the, because not only because we are supported by the ZLN or wherever, or we are supporting them, but we share now a conception of history and of a horizon in terms of our struggle to the future. I think that those are, for me, very important things. I think that Zapatista movement provided a different sense of temporality not a temporality abducted by the state, That's another one. And I think that probably we can think about it more.
Hi, thank you to both of you for your words and for your time. And also thank you for putting up the grace of the Mayan train, because in my experience, when I ask people what they think of this project, they tend to say the Mayas, like if they were like one homogeneous people, like agree or not agree. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, or it's uncomfortable because it's uncertain to say like there are like different positions. and there are different ways of considering oneself a Mayan. It's not a Maya, it's a Macehual, or I mean, there are like several ways to consider yourself. So I just wanted to say that, and like also thinking about the Museo Nacional of Antropología e Historia, I think like there's also a place in which you have several layers of the history of indigenismo in Mexico, which is also like this set of policies that shape the mestizaje, like as an ideology that I think with this type of protests, like the manichees are speaking, you know, like the object. And I am obviously like doing this because I don't think that way, but it's the way in which some anthropologists, like with these policies, and the Mexican state, like just took it, conceived them. So yeah, I just wanted to add like that part of the. I think like this is also a history of indigenismo. This new stage is like this cool indigenismo, you know, like this indigenismo that welcome the people, the indigenous people, to talk in these terms, you know, like in this room you can say this, but all in these terms. So that's and the other thing is that about this platform, or the ZLN as a platform, I think that sometimes academics and politicians, especially academics, like are going to take a look at other indigenous movements when they cite the Zapatistas. So sometimes I think it's like a strategy from some indigenous, different indigenous peoples. So that's it.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was wonderful. I have two questions. The first one is, Mario, you talked a lot about the museum and the people who were there and stuff, but I wanted to ask you more about the very idea of the apology, right? Of the apology. Disculpa, disculpa. No, no, no. About the idea, like the specific idea of the apology as an act of state, right? Because in a class that I took with Seb, actually, we talked a little bit about how these acts of the state, like truth commissions or state apologies, could also work as a way to take the present and slowly turn it into a past, right? Like close it, and yeah, give you some closure and turn it into the past, right? And just cancel it or neutralize it politically in some sense. I'm thinking very specifically of a case that happened in the university where I studied, the Tecnológico Monterrey, which is a very posh university in Mexico, in which two master students were killed by soldiers, right? Jorge Arredondo and Javier Verdugo. No, that's right. Jorge and Javier. And there was also a state apology, and there was a plaque that was put in the place where they were murdered. And it reads, they were students, not criminals, right? Making it very clear that the state wanted to say, if they were criminals, we could have executed them in the street. But I'm sorry, we made a mistake. These ones were not the ones that we were looking for, right? And that plaque gave closure to a 7 years movement, well, not 10 years movement that has been going on in the city, in the university, and in other cities, because these students were from out of state. It was kind of disbanded. And it was not until now that I think some of the responsibles were given sentences, right? So back when that happened, it was very clear that it was not really about justice, not really about actually addressing the mistakes, the horrors of the militarization, but about giving closure, of canceling one particular movement, right? So in talking about this, I would have liked to hear more about how what were the stakes, right, of this movement? What was the role of the Centro Pro? Why would the Mexican state have gotten to this place, right? Maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but I feel like that gesture cannot be just innocent, right? And like, what role do you think this gesture of the apologies was playing here? And that's it.
No, thank you. I completely agree with you, and in some sense, I think that you can see this kind of rituals from the state, as a kind of of closure, a kind of also, for example, when you examine the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, I worked on the TRC many years. It was not many years, and it was on the name. You have a kind of performative action, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truth serves only for reconciliation. It's a kind of what, and it was very like constrictive or restrictive in terms of what crimes were investigated, what, etc. In terms of the state opened the door for of course, for a kind of sanitized truth. It was very important, of course, it was. But also, for example, crimes, sexual crimes, were completely outside the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which were impressive and repeated all the time, because it was like the structure of the apartheid from black soldiers, from white soldiers, to black women. Even today, violations, rapes, and then here, in the case of this apology, I think that probably it's interesting, your question for me now, because I am reflecting now that probably it happens the contrary here. The apology opened something. For the other otomí people who said, okay, you remember those 3 women you said apology? Well, we are more than 3 women. We are 28 families. We live in the city. We need house, and we are taking the MP building, in terms of. But I think that this was possible also because for the, in terms of the Estela discourses and for the labor of the Centro Pro, which was brilliant, excellent, in terms of they constructed the case, the files, the archive, for like 7 years. 7 years they were working, trying to first to release them, of course, from jail. And after that to say, this must be repaired. This must be repaired. And of course, in Mexico you have, now we are like, half and a half and the Supreme Court. But at those times it was we had a right-wing government, but with a strong Supreme Court, and it was very important, because Olga Sánchez Cordero was Minister of the Supreme Court, with AMLO Secretaria de Gobernación. She was key in this process. She said, of course we are giving an apology, and of course we are saying I'm sorry, and of course they will be set down with the attorney's officer there, Raúl Cervantes, which was on the podium, like saying that, okay, I have to talk and say I'm sorry. But in some sense, I think with in the first version of the conference, it was like 30 pages, and I said, no, I have to cut them. I have to cut it. I was reflecting around the term apology, along with Derrida, when Derrida, referring to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, says the state gives pardon by definition, of which is unforgivable. O sea, se da el perdón a aquello que por definición es imperdonable. And then that's the main thing here, I think, in terms of reflecting. The thing is not the pardon, the apology. The thing is memory, and trying to produce a kind of memory and connection in terms of the events. For that reason, I think that it was very important, the apologies, and the shouting, the screaming from the public. They were saying, it's not only those 3, of course they are, but they are incarnating several. They named like the most 5 massacres of the 20th century. Horrible massacres, never investigated, from the state. Acteal, Postula, Tlatlaya, hasta Acteal. Acteal was horror.
Y Acteal hace 30 años.
And Tlatlaya, in the state of 31 people murdered by the military. We don't know, by the army, we don't know nothing about that.
I think that's why the apology can't be closure. It's like you say, it's opening, it's a recognition, and there can't be closure until all of these massacres are recognized, right? And it just becomes another occasion, I think, hopefully another moment to enunciate, to chingarse el Estado.
Yeah, thank you so much for the fabulous talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about method, and method in terms of centering the three women at kind of the heart of your project, but also beautifully sort of weaving us through these multiple temporalities. I think you did that through the Sala de Exposición, and you sort of connected to a speech that the person whose name is now on the Sala had, and then you walk us through material culture through the dolls, and there was this sort of like beautiful method that I would love to hear you reflect on, also in terms of centering the women and their narratives in relation to these like outward reaching connections.
Thank you, Seb. It's a beautiful question. Well, I must say, first of all, that I am I don't know if a specialist, but I work on museums, on archives, memory, more than on indigenous peoples today, or more than, but I worked on community museums or indigenous populations last 10 years or something. But in some sense, the thing with the National Museum of Anthropology is that you can feel the kind of disconnection between. Well, probably it's not a disconnection. It's the kind of connection they are producing in terms of the discourse, the labels they are reproducing, how they are. When you think that they produced in the 70s, and there's a book by Dora Sierra called 100 años de etnografía, 100 years of ethnography, relating very well all the history of the ethnographic recollection, as they say. They named cultural expeditions in the 70s as they have a military language, in terms of how they produce the sense of a national culture from indigenous peoples, And for me, that is a method from the state to produce their alterities and their glorious past, and the division between the first floor and the second floor. The first floor, like it's not only a question of time, it's also a question, that the first floor you can see all the the battles, the wars committed by the pre-conquest time, and at the second floor, sorry, you'll see just culture with no time, kind of, in the middle of no time is everything that references. And then for me, about your question on method, the most important thing, if you work on the museum, is to connect the work of the museum first in terms of the exhibitionary complex. Is not only the National Museum of Anthropology. For example, how you can read the National Museum of Anthropology in contrast or in relation to the MUEFA, which is the Museum of the Armed Forces in Mexico. The Museum of Armed Forces in Mexico, the first sala, the first hall, you can see the Cuauhtémoc, like the the last emperor before Hernán Cortés and all that. Well, not Hernán Cortés, but the last emperor, transferring the force of the Mexican soul to the independent army, you know. Then you can read better why the indigenous are bucolic in the second floor of the National Museum of Anthropology. Because they were stolen their force in terms of sovereignty, in terms of a people who fight, you know, they are beauty, the noble savage. But I think that in terms of method, one of the mistakes sometimes we commit is to go to a museum and say, well, this is the collection, this is the blah, 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 this is of course, we must do this. But for me, it's very important to enter in relationship with other museums. And, for example, what is the tienda of the National Museum of Anthropology selling, promoting, and saying in the books, in the handicraft, because it's a massive touristic museum. It's very important in terms of what is projecting to the world. And after that, I think that, after all, I think that in your question is also something important for me, which is a kind of what's in a mimicry in terms of the state use of the handicrafts, the forms, the objects in the museum, outside the museum, in the tienda. For example, connecting your question with your observation. What's your name? Sorry. Okay. I remembered one of my last trips to estoy ya mal de la cabeza. Teotitlán del Valle in Oaxaca. I worked in the community museum there in Teotitlán, and they told me a wonderful and horrible story about, you know, they were by the National Museum of Anthropology, the community was called and they said from Mexico City, from the National Museum, please come and see our collection of yours. You know, see what we have, what we are exhibiting, and say to us what you think, you know, in terms of what you are seeing here. Then they saw in the National Museum of Anthropology, in the bodegas, you know, the storage, they saw the Danzante de la Pluma, you know, which is a very important figure in Teotitlán for Zapotec cultures, in bronze, you know, and they say, we want this in our community, not here. And the museum was like, okay, but we know it's very important. And finally they said, okay, yes, we are going with you. We are restoring, devolvieron, but with one condition. We are going with a tractor, with a camion, with a bus, you know, in a kind of pilgrim from Mexico City to Teotitlán. It will be filmed in a documentary that we are restoring, you know, the peace to your community. And that took place, but the main thing is that when they were, the local authorities, traditional authorities waiting for the Danzante de la Pluma in bronze, when the Danzante arrived to Teotitlán with a car and the director of the museum and blah, 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 they told me that they were like, that's not the piece. They made a replica. And that's, you know, and in that gestures, the state is there, you know, in terms of what kind of transactions are there. And, well, I think that we must pay I like to pay attention to that material things, replica, mimicry. What's there? What kind of sensations? What kind of politics are we constructing with the politics of representation? But well, thank you for the question.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so let's give our speakers another round of applause.